We'll be doing the presentation on the topic energy interactions in Earth's surface. Electromagnetic energy is a form of energy that is reflected or emitted from the objects in the form of electrical and magnetic waves that can travel through space. EM radiation is actually all around us and it takes many forms like radio waves, microwaves, X-rays and gamma rays, etc. Sunlight is also a form of EM energy, but the visible light only takes up a small portion of the EM spectrum. Although all kinds of electromagnetic radiations are released from the sun, our atmosphere stops some kinds from getting to us. For example, the ozone layer stops a lot of harmful ultraviolet radiation from getting to us, and hence the concern for ozone layer depletion. This is just a basic figure that shows how the radiations from the sun interacts when it gets to the earth's surface. Here the radiations are almost either absorbed, reflected or transmitted. When electromagnetic energy from the sun hit the earth's surface, three fundamental energy interactions are possible. That is, all EM energy that reaches the earth's surface must be either reflected, absorbed or transmitted. Reflection is something that occurs when the radiation bounces off the target and is redirected. The absorption occurs when the radiation is absorbed into the target, and transmission is the radiation that passes through a target.
Hello, and now let's look at the energy interactions with the Earth's surface features. All EM energy reaches the Earth's surface must be either reflected, absorbed or transmitted. The proportion of each depends on the spectral reflectance properties of the surface materials. Well, what is spectral reflectance? Spectral reflectance is a measure of how much energy a surface reflects at a specific wavelength. Many surfaces reflect different amount of energy in different proportions of the spectrum. Well, that's the EM spectrum, by the way. The surface smoothness relative to the radiation wavelength. What is surface smoothness? Surface smoothness or surface roughness is a component of the surface texture. It can be defined as the deviations from the real surface. These deviations relative to the wavelength of the radiation is a factor determining which of these properties process happens. Then there is the wavelength of the radiation and then the angle of illumination. Now let's look at the types of energy interactions. Reflection. Reflection occurs when the radiation bounces off the target and is redirected. Absorption occurs when the radiation is absorbed into the target. Transmission occurs when radiation passes through the target. And emission occurs when the radiation which was previously absorbed by the surface is re-emitted or released in the form of electromagnetic waves. Now, in this diagram, EI represents the incident energy, ER represents the reflected energy, EA represents the absorbed energy, and ET represents the transmitted energy. Now, reflection. Reflection occurs when the light ray is redirected as it strikes a non-transparent surface. What is a non-transparent surface? Non-transparent surface is a surface which has the property to not let a percentage of the light of the radiation to be redirected into the same medium. Now, albedo spectral reflectance, R of lambda. The average amount of incident radiations reflected by an object at some wavelength. It can be defined as a percentage of the energy reflected comparable to the energy which is incident. That is the energy of wavelength lambda reflected upon the surface by energy of wavelength lambda incident upon the surface into 100. Just pointing out that reflection, any of the processes mentioned earlier, does not change the wavelength of the radiation which is incident. Thank you.
Reflection occurs when the radiation bounces off the target and is redirected. There are two types of reflectance, that is specular reflectance and diffuse reflectance. When the surface is smooth, we get specular or mirror-like reflection where all of the energies are directed away from the surface and is reflected on a single direction. Diffuse reflectance occurs when the surface is rough and energy is reflected almost uniformly in all directions. Most of the Earth's surface features lies somewhere between perfectly specular or perfectly diffuse reflectors. If the wavelengths are much smaller than the surface variations or particle sizes that make up the surface, diffuse reflectance will dominate. The reflectance characteristic of Earth's surface features may be quantified by measuring portion of incident energy that is reflected. This is measured as a function of wavelength and is called spectral reflectance. It is mathematically defined as energy of wavelength reflected upon the object by energy of wavelength incident upon the object, and it is expressed in percentage. A graph on the spectral reflectance of an object as a function of wavelength is termed as spectral reflectance curve.
Sun's peak radiation is in the visible and near infrared wavelength, so that only a significant amount of this incoming solar energy radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere or reflected by clouds back into space. That is about 23% is absorbed by the atmosphere and 48% is absorbed by the Earth's surface. And for a total incoming solar energy in the Earth system is about 71%. So there are primary gases that are responsible for the majority of the atmospheric absorption of energy. They are water vapor, which is a very strong absorber in 5.5 to 7 micrometer range and very strong absorber for greater than 27 micrometer range, and it is variable in time and space. That is, the water vapor in the atmosphere is also variable in time and space. This means that the absorption rate may vary depending on the location and time and of the day and the time of the day and year. Now, carbon dioxide primarily absorbs radiation in the mid and far infrared portions of the spectrum. Ozone absorbs strongly in the UV portion of the spectrum, which is very short wavelengths and is responsible for protecting us from damaging radiation that causes skin cancer. And also we know that a portion of the incoming solar radiation is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere, Earth's atmosphere. That is what we have said. So these gases absorb electromagnetic energy at certain wavelengths. Therefore, in certain portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, very little energy is absorbed, while in other portions like ultraviolet, nearly all the incoming energy is absorbed. So this portion of the spectrum that is absorbed by atmospheric gases are known as absorption bands. Transmission is when electromagnetic energy is able to pass through the atmosphere and reach the Earth's surface. Visible light largely passes through the atmosphere, and some types of electromagnetic radiation easily passes through the atmosphere, but other types do not. So this ability of the atmosphere to allow radiation to pass through it is referred as transmissivity and varies with the wavelength of the radiation. Now, transmittance is the transmitted radiation divided by incident radiation, and the gases that comprise our atmosphere absorbs radiation in certain wavelengths while allowing radiation with different wavelengths to pass through. In contrast to the absorption bands that we have discussed earlier, these are the areas of the electromagnetic spectrum where the atmosphere is essentially transparent, which is having minimal to no absorption of radiation to specific wavelengths. These regions of the spectrum or wavelengths are known as atmospheric windows since they allow the radiation to pass through the atmosphere to Earth's surface. For example, visible light and radio waves can pass relatively freely through the atmosphere while X-rays cannot. So, it is always important to keep atmospheric windows in mind when designing and selecting sensors for remote sensing application. Most remote sensing instruments on aircraft or satellite platforms operate in one or more of these atmospheric windows.
Let us discuss about what is meant by spectral reflectance. Spectral reflectance is actually the ratio of amount of energy reflected from the object to the amount of energy incident on the object. If a 100% solar radiation is incident on a surface, either the radiation is absorbed, transmitted, or reflected. The amount of energy reflected by the surface is called the spectral reflectance. Different surfaces reflect and absorb the sun's electromagnetic radiation in a different way. That is, if the object is different, then it will be absorb electromagnetic waves in a different form, and it will also reflect the waves in a different pattern. The reflectance properties of an object depends upon the material and its properties, its chemical state, the surface roughness, as well as the angle of sunlight. Spectral reflectance is calculated for particular wavelengths. Incoming solar radiation may contain radio waves, gamma waves, blue, green, red waves, etc. The how much amount of infrared waves is reflected by the surface is the spectral reflectance of that surface in the infrared wavelength range, similar to the case of the remaining waves. The spectral reflectance pattern is unique for an object. The spectral reflectance of vegetation is different from the spectral reflectance of water. Difference in the reflectance makes it possible to identify different earth surface features or materials by analyzing their spectral reflectance curves. Spectral reflectance curve. The graphical representation of spectral response over different wavelengths of electromagnetic spectrum. It is essential to interpret and analyze an image obtained in any one or multiple wavelengths. The spectral reflectance curve is also known as spectral reflectance signature, which is the spectral reflectance is a unique property of an object. Then the spectral reflectance curve is drawn between reflectance in y-axis and wavelength in micrometer in x-axis. By analyzing the spectral reflectance curve, we can easily understand the materials or earth surface. The amount of reflectance from a curve can be measured as a function of wavelength. Here the graph shows the spectral reflectance curve for vegetation, soil and water. Let me take water first. Water has a relatively low reflectance, with the clear water having the greater reflectance in the blue portion of the visible portion of the spectrum. As we come into the near infrared range, there is no reflectance. That is, the water absorbs all the infrared radiation which is incident on the surface. That is why the reflectance is zero there. Because of this, the infrared reflectance is zero. We can easily find out the surface is a water body. Next, we can take the vegetation. The vegetation, as we look into the graph of vegetation, we can see there is a peak in the 0.5 region. That is, the 0.5 is 0.5 means 0.5 micrometer. 0.5 micrometer corresponds to the green wave of the visible light. The chlorophyll on the plants, which absorbs blue and red waves and reflect green waves. That's why we can see the healthy vegetation is seen in green color, and the unhealthy vegetation is seen in yellow orange colors. As we further looking in the infrared region, there is a high reflectance for the vegetation, but the infrared region is not visible for the human. Next, we can consider the spectral reflectance of soil. The sum of the factors affecting reflectance of soil are moisture content, soil texture, surface roughness, presence of iron oxide, and organic content. If the soil contains more iron oxide, it will reflect more percentage of red color in the visible spectrum, and hence the soil is appear in the red color. The spectral reflectance of soil depends on the composition of soil. The presence of moisture in soil will decreases its reflectance. Soil moisture content is strongly related to soil texture. Coarse, sandy soils are usually well drained, resulting in low moisture content and relatively high reflectance. Poorly graded, fine textured soils generally have lower reflectance. The further explanation about these uh, curves are provided in the upcoming slides.
Now, going to the next topic, that is vegetation spectra. Vegetation has a unique spectral signature, but different types of vegetation differ in their reflectance. Plants that are stressed or diseased can also be identified by their distinct spectral signatures. The spectral reflectance of the plants depends upon the cell structure, the water content in the leaves, and also the different types of pigments present in their leaves. For example, deciduous trees such as mango tree have a higher reflectance in the near infrared compared to coniferous trees such as corn and pine. Now going to visible bands. In the visible bands, the reflectance is relatively low as the majority of the light is absorbed by the leaf pigments. Chlorophyll strongly absorbs energy in the blue and red wavelengths and reflects more green wavelength. This is why healthy vegetation appears green. That is, the pigments in the leaves absorb blue and red light of the visible region. At the same time, they doesn't absorb the green light and reflects the green light, hence the leaves and the overall plant appears green in color. Now, near infrared band. For healthy vegetation, the reflectance is much higher in the near infrared region than in the visible region due to the cellular structure of the leaves, specifically the spongy mesophyll. Therefore, healthy vegetation can be easily identified by the high NIR reflectance and generally low visible reflectance. Now, going to the shortwave infrared band. The reflectance in the shortwave infrared wavelength is related to the water content of the vegetation and its structure. Water has strong absorption bands around 1.45 and 1.95 and 2.50 micrometer. Outside these absorption bands, in the sphere region, the reflectance of the leaves generally increases with water content in the leaves decreases. Spectra of vegetation. Chlorophyll in the leaves of the plants absorb blue and red. At the same time, they reflect green light in the visible region. Vegetation has a high reflection and transmission at NIR wavelength range. By looking at this graph, we can come to the conclusion that absorption is the dominant process in the visible region. At the same time, scattering is dominant process in the near infrared region. Water absorption is increasingly important with the increasing wavelength in the infrared region. By looking at this graph, we can identify how cell structure, water content, and pigments present in the leaves affects the spectral reflectance of different types of vegetation. We can see from the graph that chlorophyll in the leaves of the plants absorbs blue and red, at the same time reflects green. that is in the first part of this graph. At the same time, water content in the plants affects the spectral reflectance in shortwave infrared region. Thank you.
The reflectance characteristics of soil. Soil texture, moisture content, it decreases reflectance, organic matter, which absorbs radiation and show low reflectance, mineral content like iron oxide, which decreases reflectance, and surface roughness. The reflectance curve of sand and silt is shown below. Soil moisture content is strongly related to soil texture. For example, coarse sandy soil are usually well drained, resulting in low moisture content and relatively high reflectance. On the other hand, poorly drained fine texture soil generally have lower reflectance. In the absence of water, however, the soil itself exhibits the reverse tendency. Otherwise, coarse texture soil appears darker than fine texture soil. Two other factors that reduce soil reflectance are surface roughness and content of organic matter. Presence of iron oxide in the soil also significantly decreases reflectance, at least in the visible region of wavelengths.
Soil moisture and texture. Soil moisture is strongly related to soil texture. Coarse and sandy soil are well drained, resulting in low moisture content and high reflectance, while poorly drained, fine textured soil have low reflectance. Thus, reflectance property of soil are consistent only within particular range of condition. Soil organic matter. In this graph, the percentage reflectance versus wavelength, the soil organic matter possesses a lower reflectance curve. The organic matter is a strong absorber of electromagnetic radiation, so more organic matter leads to darker soil. Iron oxide. Iron oxide causes a charge transfer absorption in the ultraviolet, blue, and green wavelength, and a crystal field absorption in the near infrared. Also, scattering in the red is higher than soil without iron oxide, leading to red color.
So we have been discussing upon the different properties, important properties of reflectance of soil, and this is the last property which we will be discussing about. It is known as surface roughness. So what is surface roughness? It is defined as the irregularities of the soil surface caused by factors such as soil texture, aggregate size, rock fragments, vegetation cover, and land management. Surface roughness significantly decreases the soil reflectance. Smooth surface appears black. Smooth soil surface tend to be clayey or silty, often are moist, and may contain strong absorbers such as organic content and iron oxide. Rough surface scatters EMI, and thus due to which it appears bright. So with this we have come to the end of the discussion of spectra of soil, reflectance of soil. So now let us see the reflectance of water. So water has relatively low reflectance. Transmission usually occurs in the visible bands, and a strong absorption occurs at the NIR bands. Water surface, suspended materials, and bottom of water bodies can affect the spectral response. So there are three types of possible reflectance from water body: surface reflectance, bottom reflectance, volume reflectance. Only volume reflectance contain information relating to water quality. For deep clear water bodies, volume reflectance is very low and is confined to the visible wavelengths. Water has relatively low reflectance. As you can see from the graph provided, the blue line clearly shows the low reflectance of water, with clear water having the greatest reflectance in the blue portion of the visible part of the spectrum. Water has high absorption and virtually no reflectance in near infrared wavelengths range and beyond. Turbid water has a higher reflectance in visible region than that of clear water. This is also true for waters containing high chlorophyll concentration. Water that has algae will produce a green reflectance, thus decreasing the bluish appearance, and water that is contaminated by silt reflects a brownish color. So furthermore, turbid water, as I said earlier, also yields a high reflectance compared to clear water and may be observed within the NIR region. So with this, we have come to the end of the discussion of the presentation. Hope you all have understood what we were trying to convey in our presentation. Thank you.